This year, just the two of us, we're going to a New Year's Eve live concert in Hawaii. With your mom and you guys around, the kids won't get bored. I'll let them be your responsibility, so take care, okay?
Standing at the entrance of my in-laws' house at the end of the year, my sister-in-law Julia was shining under her flashy sunglasses. Her expensive coat and huge suitcase, filled not with holiday luggage but with the unmistakable air of a vacation, made it clear she was ready for a getaway. Julia's two kids were rambunctious and full of energy. She often left them at her parents' house to enjoy her own trips, but it was too much for my elderly mother-in-law to handle alone. They were disobedient, rough with things. They didn't greet properly, nor did they apologize. Their rampages left the house in total chaos. Even now, they were running down the hall, making enough noise to disturb the neighbors. No matter how many times I said stop it, they wouldn't listen. In a panic, I asserted to Julia, "It's impossible.
Look, we're going to my parents' house. I can't take care of them."
But Julia looked down on me with cold eyes. Having graduated from a prestigious university and boasting an elite background, she seemed to consider someone like me as beneath her. Moreover, my husband and I don't have children. Every time Julia saw me, she would mockingly call me childless. Each time, it was like a dagger to my heart. Smirking, she left with her suitcase, leaving me with her kids.
It's important to smile in front of the kids, you know? It might be hard for you though. Don't look down on them just because they're not your own, and be prepared to take care of them.
My name is Sally. I'm a 34-year-old housewife. My husband Dan works for a trading company. We don't have children, but we live harmoniously, supporting each other. We live in the same town as his parents, close enough to walk. His mother is always happy that her children live nearby, and if possible, we plan to stay in this town forever. During the week, I often visit my mother-in-law. She's calm and kind, and we get along well, cooking and shopping together. Being from a rural area, I didn't have many chances to show filial piety. So, I cherished her like my own mother. My father-in-law passed away when Dan was young. Julia, my sister-in-law, would frequently visit her parents' house with her children, even after getting married. However, Julia is a highly educated individual, having graduated from a prestigious university. Furthermore, she is a woman who left a high-ranking position in an elite company after getting married. She married her current husband through a workplace, and it was particularly hurtful how she constantly compared us as a couple to herself, often making snide remarks. "I love that you guys are so happy, but not having kids is a little too much for me." Well, my brother's salary from that obscure university is nothing to sneeze at. You have to be realistic. Her arrogant attitude often troubled us. The two children born to Julia and her husband. I did meet them when they were left at my in-laws' house, but it would be an understatement to say their upbringing was well-disciplined. Julia often left her kids with her mother, claiming she had lessons in painting or flower arrangement to attend. My mother-in-law, out of love for her daughter and grandchildren, put up with it, but she was clearly struggling with the rambunctious kids. After all, she is 70 years old. Taking care of such energetic children is a tough ask, and often I was called in to help. But these kids, who wouldn't listen, needed constant supervision, and I couldn't always be there to bail her out. My husband and I tried talking to Julia and her husband about it, but our concerns fell on deaf ears.
I've asked Mom to help. Sally, you're not involved, are you? You try to meddle with the kids and then make a fuss when it doesn't suit you. It just shows you're irresponsible.
She'd retort haughtily, brushing us off. Her husband, easily swayed, would just tell us, "Don't worry about it." I had no choice but to free up my daytime schedule for my mother-in-law's sake. My mother-in-law is a social butterfly, often attending senior club events in town. There, at the end of the year, they budget for a trip for those who wish to go. She always looks forward to it, saving her pension to participate without fail. She's so excited, already buying guidebooks for the destination and checking out the sights.
It'll be cold in the mountains, won't it? So I'm planning to go buy a scarf with my friend. The preparation is part of the fun,
she'd say, her eyes sparkling with youthful excitement. Hearing her happiness warmed my heart too. However, Julia was visibly upset when she found out about the trip. Apparently, she had made plans for the end of the year and wanted to leave her kids with her mother. But my mother-in-law's trip was already paid for. The family knows this is my annual highlight, so they'll understand, she said, trying to explain the situation to Julia, who was far from convinced.
You know, I struggle every year when Mom's not around. I want to go out with just my husband too. She's the only reliable help I have, and she goes off making her own plans without considering ours. Maybe Sally and her husband wanted to come back home, didn't they? But I look forward to my trip every year. The sudden change is on your end, Julia, right?
Even my mother-in-law protested, but Julia, prioritizing her own needs, ignored it completely. She didn't stop at complaining. She went as far as calling the senior club to cancel my mother-in-law's trip. Moreover, she demonstrated thorough malice by not even informing her mother-in-law about it. The cancellation fee request from the club was how my mother-in-law found out. Her much-anticipated trip ruined, she was deeply saddened. This was too much, so I called Julia out on her behavior, and my husband and I went to complain.
Why did you cancel without permission? And you didn't even tell mother-in-law so she wouldn't notice. She's devastated.
But Julia just scowled, no matter how we put it. She even had the audacity to retort, "It's about taking care of my grandkids, you know."
There are plenty of grandmas who'd love to spend time with their grandkids. Mom's lucky to be with hers so much. A grandma who doesn't want to look after her grandkids is failing her duty.
But, Julia, you're taking advantage of Mom. She's exhausted from taking care of your kids all the time. Didn't you know the trip was her yearly break? Julia's face turned bright red with anger. But then, glaring at us, she suddenly laughed as if she had one.
You wouldn't understand, Sally, being poor and childless with too much time on your hands. You have no idea how hard it is for me, being a mother every day. Please don't butt in when you're just an outsider. Or are you saying you and your husband, with all your free time, will take care of the kids? If you can't, then just leave us alone.
Julia always had a way of responding with 5 or 10 times the force of anything said to her. My husband, who grew up with her, knew this too well and realized that once she got like this, there was no reasoning with her. We were effectively pushed out. Eventually, as the end of the year approached, we visited my in-laws' house for holiday greetings. My mother-in-law seemed a bit sad about not being able to go on her trip, but she welcomed us warmly. Then, right on cue, Julia showed up with her kids, lugging a huge suitcase. She had a lot of stuff for just a New Year's stayover. And for some reason, she had sunglasses on her head. We were taken aback by her lavish attire, as if she was heading off on a luxurious vacation. She quickly ushered her kids into the house and declared at the entrance, without even taking off her shoes.
This year, it's just me and my husband, going to a New Year's live concert in Hawaii. I guess you and Sally will be here anyway. The kids won't get bored then. I'll let them be your responsibility, so take care, okay? We'll be back by the 7th.
Despite her selfish tirade, I gathered my wits and firmly told her, it's impossible. We're taking my mother-in-law to my parents' house, so we can't look after them.
Oh, well then, why don't you take my kids with you? They're used to traveling, a little outing won't be a problem for them.
Sparks flew between me and Julia. Her husband, looking uncomfortable, popped in, urging her, we have a plane to catch. The kids were already settling in the living room, making it hard to take them away now. And they probably didn't have tickets for anyone but themselves. After turning away Julia's family, there was a risk that they might just leave the children at the airport by themselves. Julia was smirking, probably thinking her plan had worked.
Don't look so scary, Sally. Smiling is important in front of kids. It might be hard for you, being childless. Oh, and if they get hurt or sick, I'll be charging you for all the medical expenses. So be ready to take care of them.
And with that, she left the house, see you. However, we too had plans to go back to our family home. We carefully explained to the kids what was going to happen. I always had a hard time getting them to listen to me, but surprisingly the kids listened to me and agree with me. Maybe they were inwardly fed up with their mother's behavior. So we left the kids and went on a small trip with my mother-in-law. It was a surprise for her, having her travel plans ruined. We showed her various tourist spots, from famous to serene, and she was thrilled. When the new year arrived and Julia and her husband returned, she bombarded us with frantic calls. What about my kids? She probably thought leaving them would force us to care for them. Arriving at her parents' house, Julia finally realized the gravity of the situation. I calmly explained to her. The kids weren't at their grandparents' house. They were at her husband's parents', the Kirk house. We had explained everything to Mr. and Mrs. Kirk in advance, including Julia's usual behavior and her canceling her mother's trip. The Kirks were furious.
We thought you had a reliable place to leave the kids, and to learn they've been burdening others like this.
I'm truly sorry for our son's lack of discipline, they said, and both parents willingly agreed to take care of their grandchildren. The Kirk family, the opposite of the reckless Julia and her husband, seemed to be a household where strict education was valued. My mother-in-law, who was well-bred and friendly with the Kirks, was so apologetic and grateful that it was almost embarrassing. Apparently, Julia and her husband hadn't been showing their faces at their own parents' house, leaving the Kirks concerned. After this incident, the Kirks promised to take a firmer stance with their son's family. Before taking my mother-in-law back to our family home, I had explained to the kids that they were going to visit Grandpa's house on Daddy's side. Although it was a new place, the kids seemed excited, perhaps seeing it as an adventure, and went off to the Kirks without much fuss. When Julia found out the kids were at my husband's parents' house, she was left standing in an empty in-laws' house, seething over the phone.
You've really done something terrible. You're the worst,
she snapped, before hanging up abruptly. She probably had no choice but to go to the Kirks. What happened next, I learned from Mr. and Mrs. Kirk later. Julia and her husband arrived at their house only to be denied entry beyond the front door. They were scolded by the parents and ended up apologizing profusely while kneeling at the entrance. They were reunited with their kids after a while, but were warned that the grandparents would be checking in frequently, worried about neglect. We're doing this for the kids, they declared. Julia always took pride in her elite educational background. But it was no match for the prestigious and influential Kirk family. Her arguments fell flat, and she seemed to shrink day by day. Her husband, unable to stand up to his strict parents, also started staying away from home. Gradually, Julia became unable to bear the scrutiny of the Kirk family. In defiance, she began to leave everything, from childcare to household chores, to her in-laws, saying, "My husband's parents will take care of it." She started spending nights out drinking, sometimes not returning home at all. The parents, though they waited patiently to scold her, often found her too drunk to reason with. Her husband, faced with parental disapproval, started avoiding the house, drifting from business hotels to internet cafes. The parents were furious over their irresponsible behavior as parents. One night, when Julia and her husband came back late, they found the house empty. The kids were gone. Calling the Kirks in a panic, they were simply told, "We're raising them now," before the call was abruptly ended. Rushing over, they found the parents unyielding.
We can't let the kids live in a home where their parents hardly return. If you don't show real remorse, the kids might as well stay with us.
Scolded harshly, Julia and her husband had no choice but to return to their empty home. In the end, as the Kirks insisted, the kids were taken in by them. Julia and her husband started making a fuss, crying, "Our kids have been taken away. We're trying so hard, but this is unfair," trying to gain sympathy from others. However, whenever someone tried to mediate or negotiate on their behalf, they would start making excuses like, "It's not good for the kids to change environments so often." Their lack of genuine effort to get their kids back was quickly noticed by those around them, and soon no one offered them any comfort. Despite this, they continued to play the victim, saying, "No one's helping us, we're such a pitiable couple," causing those around them to gradually become annoyed. The perception of Julia and her husband worsened. Aren't those two just dumping their kids on the grandparents and partying every night? Such rumors began to circulate in the neighborhood and at Julia's husband's workplace. Unable to bear being looked down upon by those she used to scorn, my prideful sister-in-law Julia suddenly blamed me, claiming, "This is all Sally's fault." When she came to my house, she was in a furious state, accusing me wildly.
It's because of the misleading things you said to my husband's parents, Sally. You're deceiving them, aren't you? There's no way a low-educated, childless woman like you would be trusted unless you lied.
Her harsh words cut deep. But I held back and retorted.
The real problem is that you, Julia, relied too much on your mother and didn't discipline yourself. Have you ever seriously considered the children who were left alone, more than us or even your husband's parents? I'm a mother. I've been busy and working hard every day. Ignoring that is unfair, cowardly, Even a mother has her own life, it should be okay to rely on others a bit.
Our argument escalated loudly. Just then, my mother-in-law, who happened to be visiting, appeared and glared at Julia. Surprised to find she had been listening, Julia flinched.
Julia, you don't need to worry about the children anymore. You don't need to be involved as their mother. Please, don't ever cross our threshold again. You have your own life, right? I have mine too, and I don't want you to interfere anymore,"
said my mother-in-law, who had always kindly accepted her unreasonable requests. Now firmly declared her separation from Julia, who was left speechless and driven out. Julia often claimed she had been a responsible mother, looking after the children properly, but the reality was different. Not only were the children undisciplined, they didn't even know how to hold chopsticks properly. When taken shopping, they would run around screaming, crying if they didn't get their way. It was clear they knew nothing that children their age should have been taught by their parents. Patiently taught them how to hold chopsticks and the virtue of patience. When the children did something good, they were lavishly praised, carefully educating them about what is socially good and bad. The children were naturally obedient and quick learners. Raised in an environment where good behavior was earnestly praised, the once unruly kids changed dramatically. Months later, the children learned to greet properly, much to the delight not only of my husband and me but also of my mother-in-law. She had turned a blind eye to Julia and her husband's issues because she loved her grandchildren. Seeing the transformed grandchildren, she tearfully welcomed them. Recently, my mother-in-law has been visiting the Kirks regularly to see the kids. She always brings sweets and gifts, and the children always thank her politely, filling her with joy and pride. Julia and her husband, nearly estranged from both families, are still making a fuss about getting their children back. But the children, now equipped with common sense, reject the idea of returning to such a life, saying, "We don't want to go back to that kind of living, and we don't want to live with our parents." As adults, we've supported and consulted with a lawyer to ensure the children aren't harmed if Julia and her husband take any action. But the commotion about trying to get their kids back has spread throughout the neighborhood and to Julia's husband's workplace. It seems to have affected his work too, with clients stating they wanted to cease transactions if Julia's husband was in charge. His boss hastily removed him from his position, and his reputation plummeted. Overwhelmed by the situation, he resigned. Julia, who had no intention of working, reluctantly started a part-time job at a local supermarket. But she maintained her haughty attitude, saying, "I shouldn't be working for such a low hourly wage." She struggled to fit in and kept quitting. The couple is now financially struggling. They seem unable to make any rash decisions regarding their children. My husband and I, along with my mother-in-law and the Kirks, continue our peaceful interactions. In fact, we're secretly planning a surprise family trip with everyone, including my mother-in-law and the kids. While my mother-in-law is looking forward to the senior club trip she missed last year. So we're thinking she should enjoy that first, as my husband and I have discussed.